contemplative forestry has this sort of potential that no matter what you're doing in the forest, just do that thing, right? Be present. And so when I talk about the balance between ora and labora, I do think we need to make space for the time where we're not task-oriented, right? So yeah, I'm kind of saying a little bit of both, right? I'm saying both be present to the work that you have to do, but make time for being in the forest without any kind of task in mind.
Hey everyone, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is all about spirituality, I guess you could say, all about theology, which I know if you're somebody who listens to this show looking for, hard science, like what are the things I need to know to do my job better? Or what are the things I need to know to understand the forest better? What are the hard facts? What is the science? That's not going to be today. But I will argue that the people that are looking for those things, you also need to hear this. It's also something that makes forestry more human. It brings forestry into the realm of humanities. After all, we are managing it for ourselves. So for today's episode, I brought on Dr. Jason Brown, who is, I'm going to sum him up. I don't know if he'll agree on it totally, but I'm going to call him a forest theologist. Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to go with. He teaches environmental ethics, forestry, death and dying, ecological theology, and contemplative ecology, as well as the phenomenology of landscapes. These are all the things he writes about and teaches. And really, he's got this wonderful website called Holyscapes, and the links are in the show notes there. And he has these really great contemplative blogs about, the human relationship to nature. And I brought him on to talk about what he terms contemplative forestry, and also the human spiritual connection to forests. It was such a great conversation. Like we went so deep into some things, talked about religion, talked about the religions of forests, so the religions of forestry, talked about how no matter what way you're managing a forest, at the end of the day, your belief system is your religion. It may not be an institution. You may not be able to put a name on it like Christianity or Buddhism or Muslim or whatever it might be. It is a religion. At the end of the day, it's a belief system, whether it's through the economy or through that spiritual connection of believing all plants and animals and trees are literal beings and people. It's just a different type of religion. So it was a fascinating conversation, lots of cool stuff. You're going to really get something interesting out of it that you didn't expect. That much I can almost guarantee. So, yeah, thanks a lot, Jason, for taking the time to do this. It was a great deep dive. All right, if this is a return episode for you. You've been here before, you've listened before. I'd really, really cannot say enough how important it is that you rate and review this show. Wherever you're listening to it, it makes a huge difference, gets this out there, and after all, it's free content. All right, further messing around, we'll do the sponsors quick and get on with the show. Sponsors for 2024. Wes Fraser is the number one sponsor. They've been with me almost since the beginning, and I cannot do this without them. Thank you, Wes Fraser, for your support over the years. It's been fantastic. And also, Greenlink Forestry, been with me since the beginning. Could not do this without them. Thank you, Greenlink. Now, let's dive into this conversation about contemplative forestry and the human spiritual connection to forests. Here we go. First of all, Jason, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I know you're out on retreat, so you've given me some time that you otherwise had allocated for contemplative thinking, and you're going to provide it to whoever listens to this show. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely, it's so good to be here. I'm really excited.
Fantastic. I'm excited too. So, okay. First of all, we got to get to know you a little bit. And your path is one that's atypical from most of the guests that I have on here, right? So I would love to, get into your current position, your current kind of career, and how you got into that, if you can. Take wherever you want us to go. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I guess so. Your typical guest is either in natural resource management or production forestry. Is that your typical guest, would you say?
I would say so. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
I'm definitely peripheral to that world, very invested in it. So I would say the starting point for my kind of journey toward forestry would be as an anthropologist. So as an undergraduate, I started anthropology with the idea that I wanted to look at the relationship between culture and ecology. And I ended up on a field study in the highlands of Guatemala, looking at their communal forestry. And so as an anthropologist, I was looking at the relationship between forests and local communities. And I was asking that question about, how do these local villages manage their firewood supply and their timber and that sort of thing. What I was studying was the relationship between people and forests in Guatemala. And as an anthropologist, I felt like I understood the cultural landscape pretty well. I was starting to.
Sure.
But as I would go on walks with the folks I was interviewing, I got the sense that I didn't really understand the forested landscape very well.
Okay.
Right? Was this because I was coming from the North American context where it's either plantation or wilderness, and this looked like something in between, right? Because these were agricultural folks, and they had a relationship with these forests that was very different, the either protected or extracted kind of forest. So that really got me thinking about what forestry is and what it does. And there was almost like a romantic kind of epiphany moment where I was like gathering herbs with my host family, and there was this beautiful mist kind of blowing up from the lowlands, blowing up into the highlands. And it was just this sort of like beautiful moment where it's like forestry, it was just this kind of cool epiphany. And so after I graduated anthropology, I decided to pursue master's work in forestry. And I ended up at the Yale School of Forestry because they have a kind of an interdisciplinary approach. Even, they have like a concentration in social ecology. So I was really drawn to that. And I realized there's some of my mentors that I had been reading in undergraduate around this relationship between culture and ecology were at the Yale Divinity School. So John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker, who started the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, a joint master's in forestry and theology there. And that really got me thinking about this relationship between ecology and especially forests and ethics and our cultural paradigms and the way religion interacts with the natural world.
Yeah.
So I was raised in the Mormon tradition. My parents converted to Mormonism when I was younger. And the religion began in upstate New York in a forest. So the Mormon church manages a small grove of trees that they consider sacred as the sort of location of the revelations of Joseph Smith Jr., who founded the faith in the 19th century. So I went up there and had a great conversation with the forester of the Mormon Sacred Grove, who isn't himself Mormon, but has this very strong attachment to that place. Then on a forestry field trip at the end of the Yale forestry program, they took us to a Carthusian monastery in Slovenia on our tour. We were seeing like national parks and plantations, and there was like this monastery in the way, and there was forest, but I think mostly we were there for the liqueurs. Like they wanted to like show us, the forest, but we were really there to patronize the gift shop. But I ended up talking.
Let's have a good time. Yeah.
Yeah. But I ended up talking with the forester there just about this relationship between the monastery and their spirituality and these beautiful forests. And I got some time to walk, a bit by myself in that forest and just sort of think about it. And that really put me on the path of my PhD, which was basically in interdisciplinary environmental humanities at the University of British Columbia. But I studied the relationship between Roman Catholic monks in the United States and their landscapes. So sense of place and their understanding of environmental ethics and theology. And, between those two things, between Yale and UBC, master's and PhD, I worked for 2 years for the U.S. Forest Service in Utah. Mm-hmm. That was a really good experience. And I loved it, but I also realized that I think more of my contribution is more around arts and humanities and writing and thinking and teaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, I mean, your writing and your lectures are so thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed reading them, and I'm going to be following your blog for a while, I think, because you've managed to very appropriately and well-balanced explain the relationship, I feel like, between nature and humanity, nature and humans. And I just feel like I'm talking to somebody that's so reasonable and can see things clearly when I'm reading your blog. So I appreciate that. I'm not saying that you feel that way, but I'm saying you come at it from such a humble perspective. You're just like, this is what I see. This is what I think. I'm not saying you have to think that too, but good. I think this, and it's fantastic. Yeah. So I really appreciate the fact that you're putting that out there. It's really, really good. And yeah, and and especially I think because of your background, because of your religious background, because of your theological perspective, I think it provides a context that I think a lot of the forestry world is not actively thinking about.
Thanks for saying that.
We're thinking a lot about ecology, and we're thinking a lot about the hard science of it, and maybe you're thinking about multiple values and Indigenous values and how to bring in some of those more quote softer ideas, right? But that's it, right? I feel like the act of actually bringing in spirituality into forestry work is such another level that I love, and it just makes it human, right? It makes it, instead of this hard science, it's this human science, and I love it. It's really, really enjoyable. So I think I want to ask you a couple things about like what exactly are you teaching then at because you cover a lot of ground, between humanities and forestry or ecology. So like, what are you teaching right now?
Yeah. So what exactly do you, it's like, I don't, I'm very allergic to disciplinary boundaries. So I'm very lucky to have a full-time teaching job now. I was teaching adjunct in Utah, and I thought that was my fate, was to be in contract work for a very long time, which happens to a lot of us in the academic world. Mm-hmm. But the Global Humanities Department at Simon Fraser University has been very kind to me. And so I now have a full-time continuing lectureship with them. And so I am officially a religious studies lecturer. So that means that I teach the bulk of the Introduction to World Religions course, SFU. Gotcha. And so we have an online version and an in-person version. So the online version attracts 150 students 3 times a year. So a lot of students coming through that class. And then I teach it twice a year in person in Surrey and in Burnaby.
Oh, okay.
And so that's the big thing that I teach, is this sort of overview of the world's religions. And it's really just that, right? We expose students to what it's like to live in a kind of religious world view, a different one every week. So we're really just exploring the experience of being religious by talking about how different religions came about and how they interact with the world today. But I actually started teaching at SFU in the Resources and Environmental Management program, which just recently started an undergrad program. And I was teaching their environmental ethics course. So it's not in I think the philosophy department has an environmental ethics course.
Okay.
But the Resource and Environmental Management department wanted to create one that was more general, and it's also a writing intensive, so it helps the students fulfill their writing requirement. And so I taught that for a number of years before I transitioned to full-time work at Global Humanities. And so that's where I got my start at SFU, is teaching a course on environmental ethics.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then mostly a lot of religious studies. But the thing that's really fun that I get to do are these sort of general topics courses that I get to kind of put together. And one of the courses that I teach is called trees, forests, and the human imagination. And that's basically an exploration of the role of trees and forests in human culture, in mythology, in religion, literature, and then the kind of contemporary scene, like the way that the environmental movement, the way that natural resource industries, the way that their narratives are playing out today in a climate chaotic world. So it's like a whole exploration of trees and forests through human culture.
That's very cool. But yeah, I think that's something that I wish we all had in our forestry courses, right? Was this, like I said before, we talk so much about the hard sciences and maybe some of the recreational values and that kind of thing. But for whatever reason, and like every forester, forest professional, or person that works in the bush in any way, shape, or form, they didn't get into it. Something I always say is they didn't get into that work because they love 2x4s, right? They got into that work because they love the forest and they want to be able to be in it every single day and to recreate in it and to be a part of it and to have a reciprocal relationship with it. But they maybe don't have the opportunity to recognize and maybe really emphasize that importance to them. And which is why I thought that having that course, like a course like that, a course where you're tying the importance of forests to humanity as, in the spiritual context, or just in the, like, just why is it important for your mental health kind of thing, right? I think it's such a crucial aspect that we don't talk about enough. And that brings us to the whole point of today's conversation, which is the contemplative forestry, a term I've never really heard of, but it's a term that immediately brings up ideas of like, okay, that sounds like something everybody should be doing. We should be thinking about our forestry, like in what way, right? So can you explain the concept of contemplative forestry, or contemplative ecology, kind of where it came from and like what it means to you?
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll break this down over many questions.
Okay. I know it's the whole thing.
and also your point was really beautiful, right? About why folks get into forestry. That was something I noticed on my forestry field trips during my master's, was that we would be out in the forest, people would be so visibly tuned in, mm-hmm. but the word beauty very rarely came up as we were talking about the forest, right? It was very much within the paradigm and the module or whatever that we were exploring at that day, but it was just like, you could tell that was under the surface for all of us.
Yeah.
This draw was more than just the policies and more than just the ecological theory or the silvicultural technique, right? So you said that really well, that draw, that relationship. Like, I always find it funny that scientists are so focused on importance of objectivity, right? And so to me, it's like, okay, well then we should choose our scientists objectively, right? You should do a lottery system and only, these random people, okay, you guys study oceanography, you guys do forest ecology. And that's not how it works, right? People who study forest ecology are the ones who want to be in the forest, right? So there's this deep vocational allure to the forest that draws a lot of scientists into those spaces. And then they get to think objectively, right? So those two things aren't opposed, right? We're drawn to these places, and then we try to use the tools in our toolbox to take care of them, right?
You have to first care deeply about a place in order to look deeper into it.
The phrase contemplative forestry is something that I coined as a way of talking about my approach to forests, but also because I have a background in forestry, I also think it has implications for forest management, right? So contemplative ecology has been used more widely, or spiritual ecology, when we're talking about the side of the environmental movement that wants to move us into a space of seeing the world as inherently sacred, as a motivation for protecting the world. So getting into that intrinsic value of the natural world. Within environmental ethics, we can talk about instrumental and intrinsic value. So spiritual ecology or contemplative ecology, I would say, feels motivated to protect the environment because of its deep intrinsic value and our connection to that, right? So there's a lot of different writers thinking about this across the spiritual and religious, paths, we could say. So spiritual ecology then is any kind of, there's Thich Nhat Hanh was a very powerful Buddhist spiritual ecologist, you could say, right? There's a scholar named Douglas Christie, who is a scholar of early Catholic monks, and he wrote a book on contemplative ecology that explores the relationship of the early desert monks and their relationship to land and place, right? So there's this kind of ongoing conversation in ecological theology, but also across religions, about the sacredness or the sacramental quality of the natural world. Okay. So that's sort of the origin of that. And my work elaborates on that. But contemplative forestry then is kind of more of a comment on what often ends up being said about those forests in conversations about intrinsic worth. Okay, so we start to see in the spiritual or contemplative ecology movement a binary response, right? So what the industrial world did was objectify forests, and that devastated them or converted them into monoculture plantations. Therefore, what we need to do is to start seeing forests as interconnected webs of life and restoring them and protecting them and seeing them as sacred, right? So it really, in some ways, I think, strips humans of their role as participants in forest ecosystems and starts to see us as observers or protectors of forests, right? So you get a lot of the preservationist kind of motivations, the old growth protection movements, at least among the European descended activists, often frames old growth as a kind of intrinsically sacred whole, right? Like this sort of Clemensian organism that needs to be protected. The integrity of the old growth forest needs to be protected against the invading humans, as opposed to this, I think, another variation on the third way, which is a relational approach to forests. So we're not just opposing intrinsic value versus instrumental value, right? The West, we used to instrumentalize forests, and now we need to see them as intrinsically valuable. So what often happens is that in the kind of public discourse, we get these oppositions between instrumental value and intrinsic value. And so we used to think instrumentally, the world used to be an object for exploitation. But now the right way to think is that is the opposite, that everything has intrinsic value, right? And that we need to sort of protect the integrity of an ecosystem that almost always excludes us as participants, right? And sets us up as observers. And so the third way, this sort of emerging third way, would be, I think, championed best by, not always, but in a lot of ways, the approach that Indigenous people take contemporary Indigenous people take to managing forests, that's informed by their traditional teachings, which is embedded in their cultural relationship to place. So it's not instrumental, it's not intrinsic, it's relational, and that brings in intrinsic value, right? The trees have a kind of personhood, a kinship relationship. But we can also use trees, right? There's very few vegan Indigenous peoples, right? So animals and plants have personhood, right? It's not a metaphor. And again, I'm speaking in generalities, but in the kind of West Coast animistic approach to the world, many Coast Salish peoples, for example, have this animistic view. Plants and animals are people. They're not humans, but they're people. Right. And and you have to have the right relationship with these people in order to not just survive, but also to live in the world ethically. But that doesn't exclude you from reciprocating the gift of their lives. And so that's a relational approach that I think Western civilization needs to rediscover in our own lineages, right? And there's plenty of cultural history. If you want to go down the Christian route, you can go down that route. If you want to go down the Jewish route, you can go down that route, or the Stoic, or the Epicurean, right, or the pagan, the polytheistic. There's lots of different ways to rediscover that relational approach to trees and forests, as opposed to these very kind of divisive approaches where we're either intrinsic or instrumental.
It's a very simple way of seeing it.
And that's why in recent years we've seen a lot of folks talking about forest bathing as an approach to forests, right, where trees and forests are understood as a kind of healing space. And what I see that encouraging or kind of perpetuating the sense of that binary division, because it just sort of perpetuates this idea that the forest is either out there for us, or this idea that the forest has such an inherent dignity that the only thing we could possibly do is walk through kind of starry-eyed and breathing deeply. So to me, to talk about a contemplative forestry is both to appreciate the deep, mysterious, and sacred wonder that are trees and forests, but also to be able to have some kind of relationship with the forest that's not just either exploitative or aesthetic.
Absolutely. Yeah, I particularly love the concept of reciprocity when it comes to forestry. I think it's an interesting concept because I think everyone can think about how the forest offers us up, value and raw goods and whatever you might consider, you know what I mean? We get a lot of things from the forest, but it's not often that we consider what we're giving back, right? And you might argue that we're planting trees to replace the ones that we cut down. You're like, yeah, that seems like you're maintaining. That's definitely a maintenance. You're making sure that you're not actively depleting it, but there's no real thought into how you can give back in what way, and whether or not that's just a mentality, a way of considering and thinking about and contemplating the forest, so that when you do active management, you're actively thinking about all those things, or whether or not it's actually an act like many Indigenous people do, which is give a gift, right? Actually giving a gift of whether it be tobacco or something else to the land as that act of reciprocity to kind of set up that relationship actively. Actually have it's like a miniature ceremony into how why this is important, and I'm aware of this, right? And I love that concept. And I think it's one that, it's fairly new to me. Besides the fact that speaking with Indigenous peoples who have been doing that from time immemorial, but the concept of that and how that plays out in a Western world is fairly new. And I don't know that we know the path.
We don't.
You know?
No, that's my point. Right? What we end up doing is either deferring to a general idea of Indigenous reciprocity and saying, yeah, that's a really cool way to do it. But, every Indigenous community has very different approaches. The politics of Indigenous communities is very different, and different interests win out on the ground, right? So there's plenty of bad decisions made, about the management of forest in some of these communities. So there's a real diversity of approaches. And like you say, right, it isn't just that we can appropriate something like offering tobacco to a tree when we cut it down and say, well, now we're doing reciprocity, right? No, that's not, right. I don't think that that's the path forward for European descended folks, right? To just look at a practice that we don't have any kind of, ontological connection to and say, well, we'll just do that and call it reciprocity, right?
Of course, yeah.
Because, the idea of offering tobacco, for example, or offering some sacred substance to a tree before you cut it down is embedded in an animistic religious worldview that a lot of European descended folks don't share, right? So it's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think it's really good for you to say, yeah, I don't know if we have the,
Yeah.
right? I don't know. We don't know how to do that yet. And that, I think, is part of contemplative forestry and that's why I think it's aspirational. It's not like a paradigm that I have sorted out. It's not a manifesto, right? It's a question mark it's a question that I'm trying to live out, right? As Rainer Maria Rilke would say, the poet, right? Got to live the questions. And I think how European descended folks like you and I practice reciprocity authentically is one of the questions that we got to keep living for the next few generations before we figure out what it really looks like.
I love that. Just live the question. That's cool. That's a cool way to think about it, right? Just be okay with not knowing, but keep seeking the answers out. Keep seeking out what that might look like, what that might be. And that's very, very cool. I like that. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So contemplative forestry for example, just more concrete examples. If I was going to teach like a retreat or a workshop on contemplative forestry, a big part of it would be about walking in the forest, right?
Okay.
We would go out and it would be about zooming in, zooming out, right? What are the things you notice that are on the very small level? What are the things you notice that are on the very big level, right? That's, in a lot of ways, people already do this, and I'm just calling it contemplative forestry, right? It's like, what are the small things and what are the big things that you notice? Who are they? Like, who's here, right? Like what, your botany and your soil science, your entomology, your basic ecological relationships, right? Really understanding the details, right? There's a kind of particularity to that, is a practice, right? A literacy that you're cultivating, right? Like when I walk in this part of the forest, I hear the alarm call of a very particular, right? The brown creeper there's an alarm call happening every day. Oh, okay. They're probably nesting somewhere here, even though I can't ever see them,
Yeah.
Right. And so you're really zooming into that particularity. And there's a temporal dimension to that. You're coming back to places over and over the season. You're becoming literate to a place, right? You're learning to read the landscape. But on the other end of that, there's something beyond all of that, right? That's not a mathematical equation that's going to equate your connection to the place. Because no matter how many times you walk down a certain trail or path, it's always going to be slightly different. There's always going to be some emergent property or some mystery behind all of it. And even
it's always changing. It's dynamic. Yeah.
Even a biologist who studied a particular plant or a particular insect or a pine beetle or something their whole career, there's still going to be things about that particular creature that are completely beyond any kind of words or concepts or taxonomy, right? And so those are the sort of two dimensions that in the Christian contemplative tradition we would call the cataphatic and the apophatic.
Okay.
And those are Greek words or Greek derived words for, according to the words, the things we can say and the things that we simply don't have words for. Right? So they're theological terms, right? So for example, in Trinitarian Christianity, when you call God Father, you're using that cataphatic mode. You're using a word to talk about God, right? But is God a father?
Right. Like
the way that we understand fatherhood? No, right? That's just a word that points, that gestures in the direction of the divine. And so the apophatic is just realizing that ultimately our words are just poetry about a mystery, right? It's just, we're just trying to gesture towards something felt or sensed, right? And that's where I think contemplative forestry borrows from those traditions, right? Get out there and really try to understand the relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, but at the end of the day, right, your understanding is not all that's there. There's something beyond that. There's a deep otherness to the trees and the forest that you'll never fully be able to describe or grasp or connect with, right? A deep sense. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, that's that. It's that idea of true, like I call it mindfulness, right? Or just being aware of your surroundings, of what's going on, and being curious. Like it's almost like being in the zone, but like not in the zone from like a sports way where you're just like you're super hyper focused on this one activity and everything else is gone, right? You got tunnel vision. It's kind of the opposite of that, where you're super hyper aware of everything around you. And there's this, it is like, I'm not, and I'm not a religious person. I don't follow any particular religion or anything like that. I can't appreciate that relationship to the whole, the bigger, the complexity of life, and the amazing thing that is life, and the fact that this all works together, and it's all woven and complex and interwoven. And it's just this, when you can, in those few moments when you can truly grasp that for just a half a second, you're like, oh, that's something. What's that? And I find that it's very awakening, and I feel like that moment is what is kind of what I imagine being the realization of contemplative forestry, or of contemplative ecology, right? Is just recognizing how much is going on and how amazing it all is, all at the same time as recognizing that we're completely dependent on this. And I think there's a book, The Forest Unseen by George Haskell. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I had the audiobook a while back. It's been a while since I listened to it, but he talks a lot about that, right? About bringing people out to study, like, I think he studied like 1 square meter of forest land for like a year or something. He would go out and just stare at it for hours every day, and he would just write down what he saw. And like, he writes about these seemingly mundane things, like a beetle walking across a leaf, but you're sitting there going like, man, this is godlike. Like, this is incredible and amazing when you can really stop to appreciate those tiny details. There was another gentleman I recorded with a long time ago, Bruce Masterman, and he wrote a book about the same type of thing. And he just said in the recording, just be curious. If you notice something, just be curious and wonder. And like he may use the example of an ant walking across his deck, and he's like, I wonder where that ant's going. I wonder where it came from. I wonder what it was doing earlier. I wonder how old it is. I wonder what it does when it's raining, like how much of a distraction or how difficult that is for it to deal with. And he just went into this whole divulging cascade of questions about this ant. And it just makes you appreciate that whole system so much more entirely. And so, it's really interesting to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think one of the theories about the origin of religion is not that it's a kind of outdated science where we tried to explain the world, but then our explanations turned out to be false, right?
Sure. Okay.
That's sort of one notion about the origins of religion. Well, we want to understand, and so we came up with explanations, right?
Sure.
And that's sort of the straw man that Richard Dawkins throws up against religion, right? It's like religion is just, it's like you're insisting on using an old operating system, right? To understand the world, right? Okay. This is just not how the world works. We know it doesn't work this way. And that's where we get those kind of polemical, debates about God existing or not, right?
Yes, right.
As if God was a being in the world that we could adjudicate their existence, right? But the other approach is that religion has its origins in awe and wonder, and curiosity, I think, falls into that. So the ideas, the myths, the stories, the patterns, the rituals that eventually were institutionalized as religion have their origins in a deep curiosity and wonder about the world, right? Like that's why I call religion done well poetry about a mystery, right? We're just trying to articulate what it feels like to be in this place at this time, right now, right here, where it's just this, words fall short, but that's all we have is our poetry, right? And I think that is a powerful thing about the mystical traditions across the religions. They all seem to converge around this idea that ultimately the reality of the divine is unsayable. We don't know. It's a mystery. And silence is the closest thing to the language of God, right? It's not actually our dogmas and our truths that we think we can nail down, right? That's all rooted in a sense of mastery, right? We need to control and understand the world. So we come up with these codified lists of commandments or theologies or teachings.
Yeah.
But ultimately, at least from the mystical perspective, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with codification, institutionalization inherently, right? It's definitely contributed to a lot of the pain and violence in the world, institutionalization, politically and religiously. But from the mystical perspective, all of those words point to mystery. And so a contemplative forestry is one that brings together everything we can learn about the forest, but then ultimately trying to rest on the other side of those words and concepts and ideas in the beauty and the mystery of those places.
Absolutely. I love that. That's very, very cool. That brings us really effectively into your blog. I'm going to say it wrong again. Lecchio? How does it go?
Okay. So that I keep inventing words on you, right? So so far we've got contemplative ecology, and this other concept, this other concept that comes out of the mystical traditions would be what I call Lectio Terra.
Lectio Terra. Thank you. Right.
So we went from Greek for apophatic and cataphatic. Now we're going back to Latin. So Lectio Terra. So this is also rooted in the mystical tradition. There's a practice called Lectio Divina, which is it just means sacred reading. So you sit down with any sacred text and you read it not like a novel, not like a historical document, and not like a rule book, but you read it as a kind of mystical text, right? You let the words kind of sink into your heart the way water sinks into soil, right? You pray the words. So it's a much more meditative, slow reading of these texts. And as I was alluding to earlier, I think when we walk through forested spaces, we're participating in a kind of literary act. We're reading, right? We're learning to interpret the forest. So rather than doing Lectio Divina, we're not reading it. We're not sitting down with, the Bhagavad Gita or the Dhammapada.
Yes.
We're out in the forest doing a reading of the forested landscape. So I call that Lectio Terra, right? And so you move through those the steps of Lectio Divina, where you take in, right, the information, the sensory information, pay attention to what you smell, to what you see, to what you hear, and to what you feel, right? Touch the trees and the soil and the leaves, taking in information through the senses. Then you're interpreting it, inevitably interpreting it, right? Like, oh, these plants look like they're not doing so well. That tree that fell over and is now regrowing is kind of inspiring, right? It's symbolic of like how I want to be in life, right? So you're reading the landscape in that way. And then, like you say, sometimes those moments where the light comes through the trees just right, you feel, even if you're not a religious person, you feel yourself praying that moment, right? That moment is itself a kind of prayer, which could just be this sort of gratitude, kind of gobsmacked awe that you're in this place right now, right? And that's what I mean by it being a prayer. You're not going beyond that thing there to some anthropomorphic being with a petition, right? That moment itself is a kind of expression of the strangeness and beauty of being alive. So prayer. And then on the other side of prayer is contemplation, which ultimately means just resting in the beauty and the mystery of that moment. And so these are, I'm putting words to something that a lot of folks probably do already anyways, right? Which is spend time in the forest, which is observe what they see and smell and sense, which is learn lessons, and then just appreciate how beautiful it is. I don't want to say, okay, like, here's how you do it correctly. This is how I practice that this is how I walk through forest as a contemplative practice, right? I try to spend time with the senses. I try to learn from what's around me, and I try to rest in the beauty and the mystery without putting things on it.
Yeah. It lines up very well with the idea of mindfulness, right? And the idea of just being aware of what's going around you and trying to be, in the moment and try to just take it all in and appreciate it. And I really like that idea. And I appreciate your explanation of prayer and God and all that kind of stuff as well, because I remember I grew up in a Catholic household, and my parents, I remember one time when I was older, my mother and I were talking about religion as a thing, right? As an institution and as a belief system. And I remember saying that, it wasn't really for me, right? And she pointed out exactly what you said. She's like, Matthew, I see you in the forest, or I see you look at a baby, or I see you, be in the moment in a thing. And I know that you are religious. You're just not, you are aware of those things, and you're very attuned to those concepts of just being a human and appreciating the complexity of life and everything and all the mystery and all that kind of stuff. And she's like, you may not define yourself as one particular thing. She's like, but you are that. You are paying attention. And I think that's where the concept of that line between atheism and non-atheisms or everything else is kind of gets weird and kind of a bit ridiculous, right? 'Cause it's we can all appreciate that. We all appreciate the complexity and amazingness and the mystery and the divine, for the lack of a better word, like you said, right? The things that we don't understand and just the amazingness of it all. And I think we could all agree that that's real. And if you want to use the word God, I can get down on that for sure.
I think the word God, I really think the word God needs to be repurposed and revitalized, because in English, it carries a lot of baggage. And a lot of that baggage has to do with the way Abrahamic patriarchal religion has framed God as a divine masculine sky god, right? A being in the sky, right? And so I definitely understand all of the resistance to institutionalized religion, because
that's what it is, right? It's the institution, it's the history, it's the stuff that gives you that ick, right?
Yeah. And it's all of the being on the wrong side of history on so many issues, especially in North America, right? It can feel very overwhelming and disappointing, and for some people it's life and death, right? People who were raised in very religious households who have non-conforming identities, right? These are life and death issues, right? So I get it.
Totally.
I'm not trying to talk anybody into using words like God or religion, but I think like your mom, I agree with your mom, right? That this is common ground, right? Your mom's not going to stop being Catholic, and you're not going to stop being a passionate forester. But what she's pointing to is a common ground, right? This idea that we can come together in a forested space. We might use different language. We might use different sacred texts. We might see different lessons in the trees, in the birds, symbols, right? We both come to that with that sense of openness and awareness. I think that we're both doing the same thing, which is, what I would call a kind of a spirituality of the environment, or contemplative ecology, or contemplative forestry. Yeah,
I love that. I really, really love that. Yeah, it's when I was reading your okay, how do you say it again?
Lectio Terra.
Lexio?
Yeah. It's
Lexio Terra. I don't know why I wrote it down weird. That is, but when I was reading Lexio Terra, I was at once longing for that deep connection that you were writing about, and I recognized that most people, like myself included, and I'm sure a lot of other people too, get so caught up in life and the worries about life and next steps and all of these ideas of success and whatever it might be, that we kind of, the true mindfulness of it all, or as you eloquently put it, playfulness, which I love. Playfulness, such a cool idea. We can talk about that. It's hard to truly allow that to find its way out, right? And we have to give ourselves the time, because you almost have to set time aside to do this, because otherwise, I know for myself, it won't happen, right? It's tough. Life is crazy. So I want to ask, how will reflective or mindful practice or playfulness concepts affect or change you or somebody else? How do you think it affects people and changes the way they conceptualize the world?
I think we're living in a time of deep uncertainty about what our civilization is going to do next and what climate change is going to do to both our civilization and the environment. And so I think that the best way for European descended peoples to understand their place in the world, or to rediscover our place in the world, is to arrive at a place where when we listen to the land, we can hear it speaking back to us without it being a metaphor, right? Playfulness to me is the practice of paying attention to what's going on around us and listening to what the place is saying to us, right? Or to what it's trying to teach us, and not have that be some kind of like forced, like we're, well, I talk to the trees, like where we're just pretending or like I asked the plants permission to harvest it, where we're just really just trying to force or appropriate an indigenous concept, but we're really just going through the motions, right? Like a poorly executed land acknowledgement, right? That's such an important thing to engage in, but we've all been there when a land acknowledgement is just sort of rushed through and just sort of a tokenized gesture, right? So I think playfulness is the way that European descended peoples wrestle with how to live the question of what's our relationship to the natural world. Because again, this is case by case, but oftentimes when indigenous communities engage in ecological restoration, they're restoring an ecosystem that they're a part of already.
Yes.
They know what their place is in that ecology. And then again, oftentimes, but not always, when European descended institutions engage in ecological restoration, we're engaging in a practice of penance or repentance. We're trying to fix something that we broke. We're trying to put it back and then not break it again, right? And we're almost always on the outside of that, right? And there's some good things that come out of ecological restoration from that approach. But ultimately, I think it ends up reinforcing this notion that we're separate from the natural world. And we need to figure out a way to reintegrate into the natural world. I don't think we fully know how to do that yet. And we haven't fully come to terms with what it might mean, what it might imply for our way of life.
So this is a place that I didn't mean to go to today, but it strikes me that if I had to guess, what is the holdup for getting Western society to shift into this more contemplative relationship with nature? If I was going to point my finger at something, I would say it's capitalism. And I would say it's the way we run our economy and the way we value things, right? I'm not sure that that's necessarily true, but I'm gonna go with it anyways. Do you think it's possible to live this capitalist type of life and also try to live this thing, which I'm not sure if you can do contemplative, reciprocal relationship to nature properly if we're still holding on to this idea of traditional capitalist values?
That's a very fraught question. There are days when I would unapologetically agree, right? That like there is this thing called capitalism and it is the problem. And we have to do everything we can to eradicate it from the world in order to make any progress. But then there's other days when I don't think we can quite fully grasp what that word even means, what capitalism even is, if we could even delimit it into a single thing. And then there are other days when I feel like it would be in the time frame that we're dealing with when it comes to climate change. I think we'd be better suited taming the dragon than trying to slay it.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, okay, well, if market-based mechanisms are what we need right now, then let's get on that and just see how that goes. Right. So I have a whole range of emotions about the word capitalism. And so ultimately, I think
I'm with you, by the way, just so we're clear. I'm totally with you. I'm there's days where I'm like, I think this might be the only way we have right now. I think it could be pretty good if we were to rethink it a little. There's other days where I'm just like, God, this is the problem. So I'm with you. I'm not standing here on a soapbox being like, let's end it all. I'm with you.
No, I'm not a Marxist theorist. And so a Marxist theorist would try to look at social political relationships and then try to reform those in order to fix the world's problems, right? And I think there's a lot of important work that needs to be done along those lines. But the problem with that approach is that spiritual, cultural dimensions of life are seen as peripheral or epiphenomenal, right? So what determines the world outcomes, what determines history, is the material relationships, right? So when people come at you and say, well, the problem is capitalism, they usually are talking about, right, a deterministic kind of a Marxist materialism, right? That if we could just get the politics right, right, then we could fix all of these problems with our approach to forest. But I tend to be more of a cultural or idealist, right? Where the ideas are more important than material.
Yeah.
Right. And so that means that I would zoom out farther and say that we have a civilizational problem. So it's not that material economic relationships are unimportant, but that they're embedded in these broader ideas about who we are. And I think the reason that materialist consumerism is so effective, like the marketing of materialist consumerism is so effective, is because it's a genius way of telling us that we're not enough as we are. And so what we need to do is to fill the void in our soul with more and more stuff. And so if you hear that story over and over again, right, that's the world that you're living in. So a Marxist revolution isn't going to just magically make that go away, right? So we need a revolution of the heart in addition to these broader conversations about political, social relationships, class and race and all of those important discussions. But yeah, I tend to be on the side of thinking that this is ultimately a religious issue, right? Right. It's about our sense of meaning, our sense of purpose, right? And our questions about who we are.
Yeah.
It's not a coincidence that we're both having a crisis of climate and a crisis of meaning at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, for example, Vancouver, the city that I live in, they're constantly talking about how they're the greenest city. They want to be the greenest city in the world. We're going to meet all of these carbon targets and we're going to make our city bike friendly. But you also see headlines that Vancouver is the loneliest city in the world, right? So I live in the greenest city, but it's also the loneliest city, right? So to me, that's a failure to connect on questions of sustainability.
Yeah.
So if just because you met your carbon targets doesn't mean we're automatically all happy, right? Or just because, we have gender parity in the workplace, or just because we've perfectly engineered the labor market or whatever it is, right? So we need to address in addition. So I'm doing both and, right? So if your listeners are thinking I'm trying to do either or, I'm not, right? This is both and. So in addition to our carbon targets, we have to talk about our sense of self, our purpose, right? And that's the question that we're living into. What's our relationship with the natural world, right? What's our relationship to forests?
I like that a lot. You spoke about that idea. I don't think you said this. This is I'm pulling together something you said and something that was in your blog. But it's a war of ideas, right? Versus a war in the woods kind of thing. I think that was the old growth religion blog that you had, which was also very, very good. But I wanted to talk about, I think we're talking a lot about these ideas, right? So I think I want to talk a little bit about the idea of intrinsic value a little more deeply. And I had a thought, and it's a weird thought. It's kind of to hit the nail on the head, it's kind of a devil's advocate thought. But do you feel like putting spiritual values on nature, and I say putting because we're human beings and we're capable of discerning value, right? Do you think that is is kind of indulgent of us. It's just us inventing value that we've decided this is worth something, therefore it's worth something inherently or intrinsically. You know, because ultimately it takes a person to imagine spiritual or recognize spiritual value for us to put a name to it. So, like, do you think that there is intrinsic value without human beings? Do you think there's inherent value without human beings? Or do you think it's something that is invented because of a creature that is capable of imagining it?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question and I just love just sitting with the question, right? Like, I hope the listeners sit with the question, because I'm not going to demolish the question with this perfectly coherent answer, right? It's such a good question. But I think one, like where I'll start with it, would be that in the field of environmental ethics, the first thing we would try to do to answer that question is to try to come up with a rational argument to show that it's reasonable to assume, right, that there is intrinsic value in the world, right? And so we would arrive at some kind of, premises with a conclusion that would be convincing of my rational brain that intrinsic value does indeed exist outside of my aspirations or my ideas about the world, right? But before the Enlightenment, right? So even in yours and my own cultural lineages, right? Before the Enlightenment, so the medieval Christian, before that, the pagan, the polytheistic, right? If we even go back in our own lineages, we were a part of a world that spoke value, right? How did you understand your place in the world? Well, the world told you, right? You were born into a certain capacity, ability, class, or caste, right? Which we've deconstructed, and for a very good reason. But the world told you what was valuable, right? How did you understand your relationship to the world? Well, for example, astrology, right? The sun and the moon and the stars had a kind of personhood that spoke to you about the natural world, right? And our herbalism and our medicine was very archetypal, right? The color, the shape, the habitat of plants told you about how they should be used and harvested. And we got tons of stuff wrong, right? When we're talking about medical. But, our historic herbalism got a lot of things right as well, right? And our historic astronomies and astrologies, right, got a lot of things right, even though they, ultimately were superseded by other knowledge systems. And so the starting point that the human subject projects meaning onto an objective world is an Enlightenment starting point, right? Right. Most of the world historically, even in our lineages and even today, the starting point is the world itself, right? The world is alive with agencies and purpose, right? And so place names in a lot of primal myths across cultures, right? The places name themselves. The species, the different species are actually actors, persons, right? They tell you who they are. They speak their own kind of will into the world. And that's discerned, right? You discern meaning in the world. You don't just invent it or project it.
I see. Okay.
And so Western science has taught us a great deal about what the world is actually like. But I do think we need to recover a sense of the world as an active participant in the meaning that we attribute to the world. So it doesn't mean we have to reject our science for a primal view of the world in whatever lineage you come from. But I think we do need to start opening ourselves to what the world is saying to us.
Yes.
On that side of things, right?
That's very cool.
And I mean, I guess to take another tact, an evolutionary approach, right? If you just look at the evolutionary record of when humans appeared, we appeared at the stroke of midnight, right, on that evolutionary clock.
Right.
Seconds ago from, like the 13 billion year history of the universe. So did value come into existence when the human brain came into existence, right? Some philosophers might say yes, but there have been millions of years of very intentional, intelligent creatures on this planet before it that precede us, right? And I think that really speaks to the fact that value also precedes us, right? It may not be the same kind of human value, but that we articulate linguistically, but there's something deep in the heart of the world that's yearning to continue to be alive. And I would say that that's, a kind of a factual thing, right? The fact that the world exists is proof that there is something intrinsically valuable about it or to it.
But does it have monetary value?
That's the real question. Yeah.
Well, I think, as you were talking there, I was just kind of throwing it around in my brain, and I was like, I guess asking that question it's akin to being like, what is the meaning of life, right? Like, does the universe have meaning without someone able to conceptualize it? It's almost the same question, and you're like, how are we supposed to answer that? And I think one conclusion I came to when I was thinking this thought, reading your stuff, was, in the end, does it matter? Right? We are here, and we do place value on it, and we should be stewarding the landscape as if it has that intrinsic value regardless. So at the end of the day, it really doesn't change anything, but it is an interesting thought experiment, that's for sure.
I think I do still think it matters. I mean, I hear what you're saying, right? That ultimately, like, we got to just live our lives, right? Even if our ultimate purpose is somewhat mysterious. But like I said, because we're creatures that seek meaning and purpose, right? I think knowing what story we're part of is deeply stabilizing. Yeah. And so when in the early 20th century, when people became foresters and loggers, and those were really much less controversial professions, there was a story that was told about what that meant, right? That's what I mean in that article when I talk about the different approaches to forests, right? Because when I say old growth religion, I'm not just talking about the ones who want to claim that old growth is sacred, but that we resource managers, we're just managing societal values. We're not making any value judgments, right? It's like, no, any approach to the forest is inherently part of some narrative or story. And that's what I would say. Ultimately, it's a religious claim. Yep. Right. So I would say your forestry is a theology, right? Your forestry is a theology, no matter what your forestry is. It's not just the religious types or the environmentalists, the deep ecologists who are religious about forests. The sense of purpose that you feel of managing a forest sustainably, even if that's sustained yield forestry, or if it's for the benefit of the society as a whole, or you feel a real sense of satisfaction in a job well done, right? For producing jobs or producing beautiful products, right? All of that's embedded in the story that you're telling about who you are and what your relationship is to the world and to the forest.
I really appreciated that point you made in the old growth religion blog, talking about specifically about, because I think it's fairly obvious to people why, a protectionist approach, or as you put it, a Gaian approach, or is quasi-religious, right? But I especially appreciated how you pointed out that the instrumental approach, or the economic approach to forest management, is also quasi-religious in some way, right? Like, you have this belief that the market value is the thing that runs the world, that'll make everything equal, that will solve the issues if we just get that right. And you explained it obviously in much more detail, much more nuance than I just did, but I really appreciated that, because I think it's really easy for folks that see themselves as very objective, real, tangible, reasonable people or whatever, right? Where they think about the facts and the objectivity, and that's what they're going for. It's easy for them to look at somebody who maybe feels an emotional connection to something and say, oh, that's just religious kind of nonsense. But when you really look at those people, you're like, they just have a different version of that emotional connection, right? And I thought that was a fascinating insight.
Yeah. So for the listeners, right, it's like if you look at an old growth forest and you see decadent, mature, overripe, right, you're making a value judgment about the forest. And the reason you care is because you want to see that forest used in the best possible way, which in that, utilitarian approach is to, okay, well, let's harvest this. Let's regenerate this forest, right? There's a real sense of optimism. This forest is going to grow back. It's going to regenerate. And this wood is going to go, it's going to give people jobs. It's going to put food on the table, right? That's a very human story that we're telling about our relationship to trees and forests, right? And that's why I would say that it's just as religious, quote unquote, right, in the very broad sense, than an approach that says this is an ecosystem and these species evolved over millions of years in this beautiful relationship. And these trees are ancient. They're older than some of our countries, and that's amazing. And I kind of would like them to stick around for a while longer. Those are two equally valid value judgments of these forests, or at least valid in the sense that people live them out, right? That they're approaches. But what I tend to argue is that they get pitted against each other, and we get these really unproductive cultural conflicts. So the relational approach is how to live into the question of how to do this differently, right?
I loved it.
And that's what I try to cover in that article, that like, if you're just arguing about whether a tree is instrumentally valuable or intrinsically valuable, then that's a very heartbreaking dead end kind of conflict, right? We're going to just go round and round. But there's a whole cultural potential for that third space where trees can be intrinsically valuable, and we have a kind of reciprocal relationship that involves both loving, appreciating, and treating these trees as living beings, and the conditions under which we might be able to harvest and utilize their bodies, for our well-being and our good.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the question we have to live into. And that's why I say contemplative forestry, right? Because it's not just walking in the forest and zooming in on the particular and also sitting with the mystery. At the end of the day, I think we should be living in these forests as communities and seeing ourselves in relationship with them. And that's going to include decisions about how we manage them. Because you have to, we want to build houses, or we want to decide whether or not English holly is a naturalized species or an invasive species, right? We have to make decisions about what the forest is going to look like in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that those decisions, I don't think those decisions should be made from that simple binary between exploitable resource and intact, pristine ecosystem that should only resemble its historical baseline no matter what, right? Like those are those kinds of conflicts, I think, have bogged us down in a bit of a stalemate.
Totally. People picking sides, right?
Yeah. So for us Euro-descended people, we need to really figure out a way forward that's conciliatory.
Absolutely.
That's conciliatory, that we can bring together these different approaches.
Absolutely.
So I think probably we should move away from broad acre plantation forestry in some instances, right? But I think that the alternative to that isn't locking them into wilderness protected areas where all you can do is, take pictures.
It's about reciprocity, right? At the end of the day,
Yeah.
wood fiber is one of, if not the only potential truly sustainable raw resource we have, right? Besides maybe water and or life, I guess. But
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, we know we need it for paper, we need it for houses, we need wood. We're going to use wood. We need to continue to do that, but we need to find a reciprocal way through that. And I think that's it's so interesting, because I think it's so often that people, you're totally right. They combat one against the other. They're like, well, you can't take from and also treat it like a church. And you're like, well, no, you can. like we said, Indigenous people have been doing that since time immemorial. It's just a matter of reciprocity, of appreciating that you both are dependent on and should be beholden to the forest. And I find that so interesting because it just gets down to like, oh, well, what about profit, or what about my spiritual beliefs or whatever? And it's like, well, no, I find it so fascinating that we have to pick a side. It can't be both these things as we know it to be.
Yeah. And so you go back in Europe before the Industrial Revolution and before the kind of major modernizations of agriculture. And what you find are small communities living in relationship with these ecosystems that were reciprocal and in many cases, but not all, enhancing biodiversity, not decreasing it, right? So we can talk about, right, the broadleaf forest mix of oak and hazel in Europe, right? Hazelnut. In our part of the world, or on the west coast in Canada, the Garry oak, or as I like to call it, the Cascadia oak, right? This was a tree that was pretty well adapted to the drier climate that we had about, between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. But as the climate got wetter, right, Indigenous people used fire to clear encroaching Douglas fir from the oak ecosystems. And it was actually people that kept oak around in southern Vancouver Island, right? Because otherwise, without fire, Douglas fir would encroach on those oak forests.
Yeah.
Because the climate got wetter. So the conditions were favorable to Douglas fir. So fire was used to keep oak around. But that's not because oak were these, they had designated these as wilderness areas that they wanted to keep at this one particular climate. When, 2,000 years ago, when they started paying attention, it was because the acorns were givers of gifts, right? The acorn, these are what we call balano cultures, right? The cultures that cultivate acorns are balano cultures. And so there's this, I think that's one of the best examples of an anthropogenic ecosystem. And so when you hear about forest restoration projects, Garry oak ecosystems being endangered, and we're talking about restoring Garry oak ecosystems, the keystone species of a Garry oak ecosystem are people.
Yes, that's very cool.
Right? Not acorns, not oaks. Oaks aren't the keystone. They don't hold it together. Right? You need fire to keep Garry oaks around. Otherwise, Douglas fir is just going to do what they do and grow over top of them. Right? So people are the keystone species. So if you want to restore a Garry oak ecosystem, you got to have people around. And in the future, Garry oak is going to be a very versatile partner in any kind of ecology that we collaborate with. So I think they're a really cool dialogue partner for the age of humans. Garry oaks, right? Because they're versatile, they're drought tolerant, right? And they can adapt to a lot of different conditions.
Yes.
So as we move into the next few decades, I don't think we should just restore Garry oak ecosystems as we understand them, as we abstractly design them to be, and some historical baseline without people, but like what they might look like in the future with people. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it does. It does. Totally.
Yeah, okay.
Totally. No, it does. It does. Absolutely. I talk about that often, right? The role of the example I always use being in Canada, right, is exactly that. The Indigenous people have been stewarding the landscape with fire and axes for, again, forever, right? And they were part of the ecology. And the last recording I did with Christina Eisenberg, Dr. Christina Eisenberg, was all about that, right? All about that concept of how the ecology of the land drastically changed after disease hit the shores, right? And then again, after colonists started to make their way across the landscape as a result of the change in stewardship, because there was no more, a lot of the Indigenous people were wiped out.
Yeah.
So no, absolutely. We're part of this ecology, and we need to start thinking of ourselves as part of the ecology, like you said, and not that Western culture viewpoint of in control of the ecology, but part of. Yeah, no, I love that.
Right. And but again, we're going back to that living into the questions, right? So I just pointed to a historical case study in which humans acted as a keystone species in an ecosystem. That's a really cool example. I can use that to say, like, oh, well, humans, we should be part of the ecosystem. But here we are living in this complex, globalized society, and you and I, as your Euro-descended people, trying to talk about, okay, well, what does that look like in this civilization, right? I don't know, right? How much do we have to give up, right? How much do we have to leave behind? How much do we, what do we have to do? It's a real open question about what it looks like to be worthy of being a keystone species again, right? Instead of just like a supposed master or conqueror of the land. Yeah.
Totally. No, absolutely. It makes sense. So I have this question kind of nearing the end. I have two more questions for you, basically. And one is, I keep using the word tangible, but I don't know if that's right. But like, I guess, how do we activate this idea of contemplative forestry, right? How do you convince, someone who's a 30-year veteran in forestry to be contemplative about what they're doing when there's deadlines, right? And they got the mill riding their ass about getting the wood to the mill before the frost comes out and the fibers stranded at the end of some road for the rest of the summer, right? Like, the real life forestry that's happening right now, how do we convince these people that they're on a schedule, right? They got to get things done to be more contemplative. How do they activate that in their day to day?
Well, everyone's going to have to answer that differently for themselves. But I think that the system that's putting that kind of pressure on the forester needs to be in dialogue with the broader conversation, right? About ecosystems, about working conditions, about how much we're working, right? And about how intensively we're managing the landscape, right? So that's all caught up in policy and culture and expectations and perceptions of what the forest is and what it's for. But then in the Benedictine monastic tradition, so the Roman Catholics in the Benedictine order, their motto is work and prayer, right? So ora et labora. So that for them is a balance, right, throughout their day. They get up at the crack of dawn to sit in silent meditation, to do Lectio Divina, right, sacred reading, and then they chant the Psalms in their community. But then they have jobs, right? They go out and they have to either tend to the garden or they do administrative work, right, where they work in a bookbindery or a bakery, or some of them work as farmers or foresters, less nowadays, right? So they're constantly balancing those two things. And so when I worked for the Forest Service, I tried to be aware of the mystery and the beauty, but that would often just distract me from what I had to do, right? And so I had to do, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so
it was a focus issue too. Yeah.
I think it comes down to doing your job well, right? And really, really being proud of the work that you have to do, and just being present. That's mindfulness, right? Being present to the work that you have to do, the job that you have to do, and then making space for the other side, right? Balancing work and prayer and making space in your life for the times when you go out and you're just with the forest and you're not involved in the task at hand.
Gotcha.
Right. And that's ultimately why I decided to do a PhD, because I found 40 hours a week in the task mode in the forest to be too much of that. Right. I'd rather do that part-time and then, do the more contemplative work full-time. So, but everyone's going to have a different balance, what that looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So I have one last question, and it's just a play on what we've just been talking about, right? I'm wondering if you have a template for people that want to take that time out of their day to go and just sit or walk or whatever it might be and try to be contemplative, right? I think in this day and age, people want a how-to. How do we do that? So what do you do? What do you recommend doing for people that are just starting this and trying to explore this idea?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not trying to talk anyone who's in the thick of their day-to-day forestry work.
Yeah.
Of being anywhere but right there in that moment, right? And try to try to be grateful and appreciative of the work that you have, and to be present to that work. And in some ways that's a contemplative practice in its own right. When you're washing the dishes, wash the dishes, right? If you're marking trees, mark trees, right? That's a contemplative practice. And that's why I think contemplative forestry has this sort of potential that no matter what you're doing in the forest, just do that thing, right? Be present. And so when I talk about the balance between ora and labora, I do think we need to make space for the time where we're not task oriented, right? So yeah, I'm kind of saying a little bit of both, right? I'm saying both be present to the work that you have to do, but make time for being in the forest without any kind of task in mind. And when you do that, I just would recommend paying attention to what's happening in your immediate environment, right? Tune into your senses. Vision, we're very visually focused. So close your eyes sometimes, right? Close your eyes. What do you smell? What do you feel on your skin? If there's edible food, eat the berries. What do they taste like? Really be present to that. And I think that's a really good starting point, the senses, right? Start with your senses.
I love that.
And then I really like the scale as well, right? Zoom in around on the ground. What's the smallest thing you can see, right? And then what's the biggest thing you can see? Going in between those different size scales is a really good practice for that.
That's fantastic.
And then just, bit by bit, work on your literacy. Some days you should focus on plants, ID, right? Do some plant ID while you're out there. Or bring your binoculars and do some birding. Or a hand lens, right? So you can look at lichens and mosses and fungi. But don't let that be the only thing you're doing, right? Zoom in and out from those sort of particularity to that sort of beyond the names. Because sometimes
be aware of all scales.
Yeah, sometimes I'm like, okay, I just identified 3 plants, but there's like 10 more that I don't know.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, just put that down and just be here,
Yeah.
Notice the texture, the color, the quality of the light, the change of the patterns, right? Yeah. So just that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Making time for that kind of meandering openness in the forest, I think is important.
Absolutely. For myself, I've always found it takes me 10 slow, deep breaths to actually change the way my mind is working, right? If my mind is rushing through all the things I have to do and I'm trying to be mindful and I can't, and I'm just, okay, I stand there for a minute or 2 or whatever it takes to do 10 deep, in through the nose, out through the mouth breaths, and just let that every breath kind of center you a little bit more. And I find that always helps me, that when I open my eyes, when that's over, I'm like, okay, I'm here. That's what it takes for me personally. And then I start to try to do all those things that you're discussing. And I think it's funny how something so simple as paying attention can be so life altering.
Yeah. You said, that was, it's such a good way to talk about it, right? Just show up and breathe. It's such a better, because even the way I talked about it, people could be like, okay, well, I got to do this and this. And then, I got to focus on my senses. It's like, no. Like those are options, but like the way you said
it,
much better, right? Show up, breathe. I like that.
This has been an incredible conversation, Jason. I really could talk to you for hours on this. I wish we lived closer and we could, meet up for a coffee every once in a while and just talk about this stuff, because you can go so deep into it and there's just so many options. And I'm definitely gonna be keeping tabs on your blog and your talks, because they're just I don't know, it's just balanced and eye-opening, and I think you're doing such a fantastic job of being aware of kind of your surroundings, like we just discussed, right? So it's fantastic. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm looking forward to sharing this with folks.
Yeah, I wish we could have done this in the forest, but then we would have just ended up on all of these other tangents. But yeah, and there's so many different layers, right? Like, but I think people listening should really just, make time, unstructured time, right, to go and be with trees. And it doesn't have to be in a wilderness area. It could be a city park. It could be a managed forest. It can be a protected area. But yeah, just making that time to balance work tasks and unstructured time. So yeah, thanks.
I often do it in my backyard.
Yeah, there you go.
This is fantastic. Awesome. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for listening. I don't know about you, but that was a very refreshing conversation for me. I appreciated it so much. So thank you, Jason, for taking the time to dive deep into some of these concepts and for your willingness to be open and talk about some of these kind of harder to grasp concepts that are kind of out there in the ether and hard to put words to. So I appreciate it. Again, if you like this episode, please rate and review it. It makes a huge difference. I really appreciate it. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. Take it easy.